Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all today to this dialogue entitled Reducing Climate-Driven Instability and Conflict over Land and Natural Resources, What Role for Customary and Informal Justice Actors. This session is hosted by IDLO in the context of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference 2021. I'm Ilaria Bottigliero. I'm the Director of Policy Research and Learning at IDLO. IDLO is the only intergovernmental organization exclusively dedicated to advancing the rule of law as an enabler of sustainable development. As part of our strategic plan, we are committed to climate justice, with solutions to the climate crisis that are both people-centered and anchored in the rule of law. We are all aware that climate change is already resulting in growing scarcities of arable land, water, and other natural resources worldwide. These scarcities tend to aggravate existing injustices and exacerbate the marginalization and vulnerability of women, young people, indigenous communities, and other groups directly depending on basic resources. They also fuel competition over resources that increases the risk of instability and violent conflict, both among communities and between communities and the state. In his recent remarks to the Security Council's high-level open debate on the maintenance of international peace and security, the UN Secretary General clearly linked climate and security. He said that our window of opportunity to prevent the worst climate impacts is rapidly closing, that much bolder climate action is needed ahead of COP26 to maintain international peace and security, and that dialogue to better share and manage resources is essential to achieve our climate goals and ensure that people have access to sustainable livelihoods. It is therefore imperative to look for innovative solutions to ensure climate justice and find better, more equitable ways to use and manage natural resources. Customary and informal justice actors can be part of the solution, especially in fragile contexts where everyday access to land, water, and natural resources is often governed by customary and informal rules. Customary and informal justice actors, ranging from traditional authorities to indigenous leaders to informal power brokers, operate based on rules that are culturally resonant. They are typically viewed as legitimate by local populations. And in fact, as a matter of fact, globally, an overwhelming number of disputes related to the management of land and other natural resources are resolved at the local level through customary and informal justice mechanisms, because they are more proximate, faster, and cheaper. It is therefore essential to keep them at the core of our discussions on climate action. However, customary and informal justice systems are often rooted in established power relations, and thus they tend to reinforce existing conservative and patriarchal norms. To ensure equitable use and access to land and natural resources and minimize the risk of conflict and insecurity, customary and informal justice providers must be able to adhere to the rule of law and coordinate with statutory justice providers. They must also advance the rights of all people, including women, young people, and indigenous communities, and manage disputes between diverse communities based on principles of equality and non-discrimination. At the same time, justice seekers, especially the most vulnerable ones, must be empowered to access such informal systems on an equal basis and without discrimination. With that in mind, IDLO is very pleased to host this panel today, looking at how customary and informal justice systems can contribute to reducing conflict over land and resources driven by climate change. This discussion is very much in line with our forthcoming policy paper on climate justice, which will be available soon on our website, which, among other recommendations, calls on all stakeholders to engage with customary, informal, and indigenous justice systems to protect biodiversity and promote sustainable use of natural resources. This is also an important discussion to take forward during the upcoming COP26 negotiations next month, if we want to ensure that no one is left behind in the path to climate justice. So before I introduce our wonderful distinguished panelists today, let me share with you a few housekeeping rules. First of all, our panelists will frame the discussion today with some brief introductory remarks, after which the audience will be invited to contribute insights or to pose questions through the Zoom Q&A box. The chat will be moderated by my colleague, Michael Warren, who will select some questions for the panelists. So please feel free to start already putting your questions in the Q&A box. We will have a lively discussion just at the end of the introductory remarks. Finally, please note that this meeting will be recorded. So without further ado, let me just turn to some brief introductions. I'm really delighted to have with us today three expert contributors, starting with Ms. Bernadette Bakide, who is the Director of Access to Land Justice at LandNet Uganda. We also have, hello Bernadette.
Hello Ilaria, good afternoon, good evening.
We also have with us today Ms. Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, who is the coordinator of the Association of Peul Women and Autochthonous People of Chad, and a board member of International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change. Good afternoon, Hindu.
Hi everyone.
And I'm also delighted to have with us Dr. Julie Benman-Plouffe, who is our IDLO Rule of Law Specialist. Hello, Julie.
Hello, Ilaria. Can
you see
me?
Let's start our discussion, Bernadette. I have an initial question for you. In your view, what are some of the ways that justice seekers can demand justice to be more inclusive, responsible, and accountable in ways that strengthen access to land, water, and natural resources, especially for women? Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience in Uganda? What has worked for you in your country? Thank you, Bernadette, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. Good afternoon. I think in Uganda, when we look at justice seekers, we're looking at all actors, both formal and informal. That is one thing that we should take note of. And then there are different levels of the different justice seekers. We're looking at the women, we're looking at the children, we're also looking at the adult youth. Because in Uganda, that's how we categorize them. Because we've realized that when you look at our population, majority, let's say about 75% are adult youth. So that is also a sector which we are also trying to incorporate in these conversations. So I think that is one aspect that we need to actually take note of as we follow the SDGs principle of leave no one behind. We have a high unemployment rate. Very many people are rushing to land. And now with COVID, there's more pressure on actually land. And the pressure is because when you look at Uganda's GDP is really based on what is produced on land, what is produced in water. So basically, we have a high reliance on land, but the land is not increasing in size, but the population is also increasing. And then if the population is increasing, then you have a higher between 18 to 30-year-olds who are unemployed, who are uneducated, who don't have access to land. So, but basically, let me start with the positives. In Uganda, we have a very good framework when it comes to climate issues related to climate adaptation. But the challenge we have is, despite having these policies in place, they're not implemented or they're not well resourced. So that is something that we actually have been thinking about, especially in relation to climate, issues related to climate. But also, we also need to ask our questions. How many people, including civil society, because we fall under the informal justice structures, how many are actually inclined towards discussions related to climate change, climate adaptability? How many are even part of the discussions related to policy reform? Do we even understand these conversations, or we go straight into land? That is also another issue that we've been discussing over the years. But when it comes to land, we're looking at a process which I should mention that we have a national land policy which also incorporates issues of climate change. But the policy was actually passed in 2013. But when you look at all the laws that affect the national policy were passed before that. So we are currently in the process of review and updating all the laws related to land. So that is also another conversation where we have to update the laws so that they're aligned to the current issues, which also includes climate change. The other issue is that we're looking at informal justice mechanisms. There is a recognition, when I put it in quotes, recognition of what is existing, because our constitution guarantees the right, actually gives land to the power vested when it comes to land vests in the citizens of Uganda, which means everyone has at least a role to play when it comes to land rights. But when you go back into the laws, I've mentioned that the laws are still, they're not aligned to the national policy, but also the issue of knowledge, the issue of information. Information is not translated. Information is still in the local language. You're looking at majority of Ugandans who are not even educated, who are not knowledgeable on land rights. It's a continuous process. But now you also have to look at issues of COVID. COVID has come in. It has changed the status quo. Most people are now running back to land for survival. So we are looking at talking about rights is one angle, but also you're talking about survival needs. We need to harmonize these two so that we can have a holistic approach to address the challenges the actors are facing. But also, apart from those two aspects, there is an issue of numbers. How many people are actually participating in this conversation? And it's not only about numbers in terms of, like, for example, when you look at women, when you look at the youth, the adult youth, how many are actually part of these conversations? How many are we including in these conversations? They might be part of the conversation, but actually, how many are part of the decision-making discussions? We're looking at the formal and informal structures. When we go to the formal justice mechanisms, there are issues related to how many women, how many female judges do we have in the justice sector? But apart from the female, how many justice actors are actually, like judges, how many are actually conversant with the challenges that people are facing when it comes to land? As I mentioned, we're talking about land rights, and then we are also looking at survival. The other issue is that we have the informal justice mechanism. The Constitution clearly provides that, yeah, everyone has the right to practice. But the informal justice structures, yes, we are governed. We have different laws that governs and gives us the mandate to operate. But are we having joint discussions with the formal structures? Have we also included them? Have we included have we made, like, for example, when you talk about cultural institutions, to understand that there is this constitution, there are these fundamental human rights that are enshrined within the constitution, but are also internationally recognized? Can we apply them within the cultures and norms? The challenge we have is that people, let me start with the positive. The positive is that people go to this. Ilario, you've mentioned this. People go to these structures because in terms of proximity, in terms of costs, in terms of affordability, but also because they speak the common language. But when it comes to the norms and practices and the values, these are not documented. Most of them are not documented. They're just passed on from generation to generation through word of mouth. But they are currently being eroded into the current issue discussions on gender equality. But what strategies have we taken to include them in these discussions? I think there's a big gap, I should say, or disconnect between what is working and what is not working. And how are we harmonizing these two structures? Because when you look at the informal structures, they are doing a good job. But the question is, are they recognized? Is the job actually recognized? If I might recognize it as Bernadette, but when it comes to implementation or effecting this decision, I reach a standstill because the courts will still say that, okay, because the courts rely on facts and evidence and the law, you know. But when it comes to the informal structures, they rely on practices. This is our practice. This is our norm. These are our values, you know. But the question is, are these documented? How are they passed on? How are they including these other aspects? How have we engaged them in these structures? So what we are trying to do, they've been recognized in Uganda under the legal and policy framework, but as LandNet, we're trying to see that there's that conversation of harmonizing the decisions, for example, the decisions that are made by the formal structures, and also recognizing the decisions of the informal structures. But also there's a lot of continuous training. We need to continue training, sensitization, awareness raising of the communities. But also there's also a gap in terms of the tools, the knowledge tools, what exists. We have a lot of duplicity. And then again, there's also an issue of duplicity in terms of the work we do. It might be the same, but in terms of harmonization, that's where there's still some gap. Are we having a similar conversation? Are we having such discussions where we can harmonize the different efforts by different actors? So Ilaria, that is in a snapshot what I can share about Uganda.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. It's extremely interesting, and you raised so many good points. How many people are participating in decision making? I think that's a key point for us to discuss. Decision making about climate justice, climate action needs the participation of everyone. So how can we ensure that constituencies are represented? You also asked a very good point about women's participation in the justice sector. And here we're talking, of course, about customary and informal justice, but this is a problem also in formal justice systems. How many women are really part of the judiciary and the justice sector more generally? So these are questions that I'm sure will be also discussed later on during the Q&A. Thank you so much for the moment, Bernadette. And let me pass the floor to Hindu. Hindu, I have a question for you that has to do with the potential practical role of indigenous leaders both as advocates for their community, but also as customer and informal justice sector providers themselves. So what can be the role of traditional leaders to help reduce conflict over land and natural resource in your experience? The floor is yours. Thank you, Hindu.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. Hi, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to be with all of you and listening from your introductory remark, how it is so important to talk about the conflict over resources and how the conflict over resources that impact in also the indigenous communities. So as I'm coming from the indigenous communities, I know that our governance system are completely different. And in this governance system, we have every communities who have his own protocol of working at the communities and who create their own legislation and safeguard in order to protect the land that they own and then the land that they are managing. So, you know, indigenous communities live in a different ecosystem. So for those who are living in the forest or glaciers or in the islands or in the savannas, so the way of managing the land is a bit different according to each realities. So like in my communities, we are depending from a big amount of land. As pastoralists, we are transboundary sometimes, and sometimes we are even at the national circumstance that from one region to another regions. So all that do not have the same legislations when we talk about the government legislations and when we talk about the customary law and customary management of the natural resources. So let me take you through the concrete examples. As in my community, we depend from 5 to 6 countries: Chad, Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, Central African Republic, and even to Sudan. So all those land, we are moving from one season to another one. So from the dry season, we know exactly which space that we have to be. And from the rain season, in which space we have to be. So that makes the communities are crossing the borders from one to another corner. So they are following the rain. And the particularity is, before the colonization, that used to be our traditional land where we are occupying and live on it. With the colonizations, so when they cut our country Chad, it's Chad, Cameroon is Cameroon, so they divide the communities, but they cannot divide the natural resources who are there. So that's why also we have the rivers who are crossing one frontier to another one. We have the forests that are continuing from one frontier to another one. And as we are following the rain and the pastures, so we are not following the frontiers that are cut by the colonizer, but we are following this nature. And that's also how we are keeping the nature. However, so when you take a legislation from one country to another one, they are not similar at all. So they are always adapt to each government, and government adopted when they change also to a new government. So then they do not have a coordination in all this the legislation of the natural resources transboundary. So from our communities, we do have the same before the colonizations, because we always know where to find the water and pastures. So that make our governance system is more sustainable according to management of the natural resources. But when the conflict come, and this conflict come from just one border, so it's going to be managed differently, and then it's impact the governance traditional, the customary law. So because of this lack of coordination of the legislation across boundary, so it's impacted. So for examples, when the communities take the cattle and move from Chad to Central African Republic, And then they have to pay 2 times the taxes because it is not the same legislation from one country to another one. And then, of course, at the same time, so these legislations cannot be adapted to the pastorals and to the farmers. So that creates the conflict between the two communities. And when they start to resolve this conflict, it's not going to apply the same in the other legislation, other countries when they come back. So that makes it more complicated for the customary law to be copied across all the land at the same time and resolve the issues. So how we do these resolutions, these are the important questions that you ask. So we do these resolutions by building the alliances between the communities who are living across all the land that they used to manage in a traditional way. And that's called to the old way of protocols of management. We know in which season, which communities are coming and camping around the area. So when the conflict comes, they call the traditional leaders of the indigenous communities, and they call also the religious leaders, because those two are working hand by hand for a long time in order to put the communities around the same circle and discuss how is the management of these natural resources. So this is one way we are continuing doing to resolve this conflict over resources in transboundary who do not appear into the colonization way. The second things that we are doing, it is how we can use the science from the geographical informations and the traditional knowledge and traditional customs to put them together in order to manage the conflict over resources. As you know, many of the countries in Africa, and I can give you the example of my own country in Chad, they do not have a clear legislation on land tenure. So you take the constitutions who say there is land resources all belong to the countries, belong to the government. And then you have another paragraph who say the customary law is recognized. So it's become contradictory. So for us to come clear all these contradictions, so we use this traditional knowledge and the science knowledge together. And peoples always put those decisions in the oral way, because we are a oral peoples. So we do not believe only you have to write things and then peoples do not read and write. So you have to believe someone in his wording, and that make the indigenous system of management is a very important way of building the confidence, because if there is no confidence, it will be no resource management, and it will be always the conflict between the communities. So in this way, we have the geographical informations based on traditional knowledge. So we use a mapping management like the participatory mapping, where the communities can come together and then talk over the history, the last 10 or 20 years, how the elders describe this ecosystem, how they used to manage it. And then they come to the younger generation, how now these resources are managed because of the impact of the climate change. It is not the same resources that exist. And that helped to build a trajectory for the future, how we can project to share these shrinking resources and manage them. And at the end, you found the communities who come and open the corridors. Access to the water is very important for everyone and each, and how they can manage the remaining resources in order to sustain it for the long term. So this call me to the last point on how we do that transgenerational way, through the educational way, and through also the wisdom of passing the knowledge through generation. So when we pass it, in my communities, we do have something. When you grow up, you have to understand your 7 past generations, like your grandpa, your great-grandpa, until 7 of them, what they did how they live. And then that help you when you take the decision to think over the 7 upcoming generation. So the long term, not like 100 by 2050 net zero, no. It is up to all the 7 upcoming generations that you can think. And that help you to build the better management of natural resources, and also the conflict of resources can be managed with all the communities together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Indu. Thank you for your intervention. It's absolutely fascinating. And you're raising points from the local perspective, which is essential, because you have highlighted the transboundary nature of the challenge, but also how traditional measures to protect nature went across borders. And traditionally, the existence of laws can be also a challenge. So laws can be, of course, a solution, but can be also part of the problem, because the challenges that we are facing definitely go across borders. So they are transboundary in nature. You also highlighted the importance of local and community solutions. And one element that I'm very grateful for your highlighting is the question of transgenerational and intergenerational justice. So how can we ensure that climate justice applies also to generations to come? So there will be, I'm sure, quite a lot of questions for you later on, but let me now pass the floor to Julie. Julie, how can, having heard from Bernadette and Hindu, from your perspective, how can organizations such as IDLO harness the transformative potential of customary and informal justice actors and their role in reducing conflict over management of natural resources? How can we design better interventions? Thank you, Julie, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ilaria. Actually, I cannot start my video. I don't know why. I don't know if you can do it.
It's okay, Julie. We can hear you very well, so please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Ilaria. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work and our engagements with customary and informal justice actors on issues related to climate change in the Sahel. Before explaining how we support justice system, both formal and informal, in several regions of the Sahel and in Africa in general, I would like to come back on a common confusion that people and even policymakers actually tend to make about climate change in the Sahel, especially when it comes to conflict and insecurity. We have indeed seen a rise in violence and conflict in the Sahel over the last few years. So if climate change has certainly contributed to aggravate insecurity, it is more the competition over land and access to natural resource that has a direct impact on violence, criminality, and conflicts. It is also the inability of the Sahelian state to respond to common crimes and disputes, such as banditry, cattle theft, dispute over lands, or attacks on roads and markets, that has largely contributed to feed community tensions, and especially between farmers and herders. I mean, we have seen that in Mali, in a tragic ways last year and the year before. And farmers tend to, I mean, to really make, sorry, to draw a little bit the image that we can see in the Sahel, farmers tend to be seen as more privileged than herders because they are more protected by public policies and laws. So we know now how these rules and laws applicable to land properties and natural resource, or even the absence of laws in certain regions, are seen as unfair and how this tension created by the unfair states are largely exploited by terrorist and non-armed groups. In the Sahel, cases related to land and natural resource are one of the central issues around which people seek justice resolution. But unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, the most excluded and marginalized people, such as women, youth, and some minorities, are they struggle to claim their rights and are given no chance to resolve their disputes in a timely and fair manner. That being said, we can see how judicial institutions, either formal or informal, have the ability to act and make a positive change on issues related to climate justice. So from negative, we can still see that we have possibility of acting, though what we tend to hear is that climate change is external causality that only the international community can have an impact on, but actually it's a little bit more complex than that. So in remote areas of the Sahel, basically where the state is absent, and we have seen it in Mali this last 10 years, we see it more and more, unfortunately, in Burkina Faso and Niger for different reasons, sometimes because of the spread of terrorist group or even because of the COVID situation. Disputes are largely resolved outside formal courts. So this is why the customary and informal justice leader offers the first mechanism, through which people seek justice. We now, IDLO, but the rest of the international community, bilateral implementing partners also have seen the engagement with customary and informal justice provider as a practical necessity, as they are in a better position to respond to the needs of people that may not have access to formal courts otherwise. And actually, the international community have recognized all the benefits that the CIG providers can offer. They are more accessible, both geographically and financially. They are speedier than institutional justice system. Sometimes they give their decision within few days, while it could take several years for magistrate to deliver justice. They are more responsive to people's need. For example, they privilege, compensation and community harmony rather than punitive justice. They are more understandable by the communities they serve, either by the language they use or because the procedure are easy to understand. And of course, they are seen as more legitimate because they are closer to the communities they serve. Unfortunately, on the topic of climate change and conflict, dispute over land and natural resources, this system have also reached their limits because they can be seen as unfair. And the good news is that this system are flexible and adaptive, as they have always to show their legitimacy among their communities. So how do we do engagement with CIG actors in our program? We have understood that they are well placed to regulate access to land and natural resource for most vulnerable people. And we have supported exchange platforms, between CIG and formal justice actors that contribute to dialogues and mutual learning. in the region of Lake Tacourma, so the Three Borders region that is very vulnerable to insecurity and conflict, we have supported cadre de concertation, consultation frameworks, where formal justice and CIG actors can meet on a regular basis and exchange on various topics. First, the formal justice actors were actually the most skeptical about the benefits of including CIG providers in their meeting. But eventually, this consultation framework have contributed to build trust between both systems. CIG actors understand how they can gain from learning from formal justice actors, while formal justice actors have a better understanding of justice seekers' needs. Just to give you an example, in Mali, this consultation mechanism have seen great results, notably in terms of upwards accountability. We have seen a rise of CIG actors referring to formal magistrates when they encounter a case that they are not sure about. And their CIG actors are more and more registering their case in formal courts. We have also worked on empowering justice seekers in the most areas of the three countries. And we have worked with civil organizations, legal aid agencies to reach out to the most vulnerable community, especially women, to raise their awareness on their rights, mainly in lands, on lands and natural resources. And we have empowered them in accessing justice, So this is mainly how we have approached and engaged with the CIG actors in the Sahel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie. And thanks for your excellent point from the Sahel. It's a region that is, as we know, is particularly affected by climate change. You mentioned something that it's really coming out of this discussion today, that the most vulnerable groups are actually not empowered to take decisions, but also to participate in redress and remedy mechanisms for harm done. So there is a lot to say about that, but we would need some space for our Q&A session. So I've already received quite a few questions from all of you, the participants. So thank you for being so active. We have a question for Hindu. Hindu, your presentation attracted a lot of comments, and our colleague Andrew Kasper from the EU delegation in New York is asking if perhaps you could explain a bit more how climate change impacts on land conflict in your country. So how do you see climate change affecting peace and conflict, basically, in your country? Very briefly. Thank you, Hindu.
Right. Thank you very much, Ilaria, and thank you, Andrew, for the questions. So, I give you the concrete example around the Lake Chad, because this is the place that can talk to the peoples. But of course, there are a lot of other places who have the similar impact. So, in 1960, it was about 25,000 kilometers square of fresh water. It was just when my mom get born. And then to now we have about 90% of this water just evaporated. So we still just have between 2,000 or 3,000, depending from the rain season that we have each year of kilometer squares. So for us, this concrete impact, it's leading to all the natural resources loss. So we are seeing that a lot of ecosystem that disappearing. We used to have a lot of animals around the Lake Chad that are gone. Now they are not around this place at all, like elephant, lion, and all, they are not around this place. And of course, all the pastures who used to be green around this place are not there anymore. Then the consequences is the communities who are living and depending from this fragile ecosystem are pastoralists, farmers, or fisher peoples. And then when the resource is shrinking, all of them are coming to this resource to get access. So this is the source of conflict between the communities. And you know, when you are pastoralists, you take your cattle. During the rain season, you go away from the Lake Chad. And during the dry season, you come to find the water. And when you come back, you have already the farms who are using the wetland there. And then you cannot get access to the water. It is immediately the conflict. And that leads to the broader conflict of terrorists, as Julia also said, because the poverty is increasing around this place. And when poverty increasing, you have a terrorist group who come like Boko Haram and settle around all the regions of the Lake Chad, between Chad, Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, and all. And then it is very easy to recruit the young people who are there because they are very poor and the resources are not there. They are getting not money, and then they just so easy to recruit them. So all those conflict over resources are so visible in a daily life of the communities, and it's ending up from one year to another one with the food insecurities, with the conflict, with the migrations, and then at the end of the day, it's become really not livable around all these places.
Thank you so much, Indu. We also have several questions about the role of the business sector. Bernadette, there is a question from David Andrew Wardell. He's asking, several studies have highlighted the business sector tends to be disproportionately represented in governing bodies of the various multi-stakeholders initiatives that are taking place. Now, you mentioned the sometimes lack of visibility of or participation in decision-making of vulnerable groups. So how can we ensure that multi-stakeholder initiatives are more represented? And in particular, they take into account the reality of customary and informal justice sector from your perspective?
Thank you, Ilaria. Thank you for that question. When it comes to the business sector, I think in Uganda, we have tried to incorporate them in the different discussions at different platforms in terms of corporate social responsibility. But it's still not sufficient because there is no clear commitment to the current structures. Why? Because we still have existing gaps. For example, I mentioned the fact that most of the traditions, most of the informal justice mechanisms are not documented. They're not standardized where someone can easily invest into that development, or maybe development of a training manual, development of knowledge tools. There's still that gap. So someone, if you're to bring in the business sector, it needs formalization. They need to understand. And then also when we look at the business sector, majority are small, medium enterprises. So most of them they still have gaps in terms of knowledge, in terms of understanding their position within these structures, in terms of understanding the rules and the governance structures that regulate them. So there's still a lot of information that we need to first train them on, and then for them to be part of these conversations. Then when you look at the broader business sector, I think the one that we've had is in terms of we have multi-stakeholder platforms that we have these conversations. They're part of these conversations. Question is, do they even understand what is taking place when you're looking at land and the issues and challenges within land? And then also we have the issues related to the ordinary community person. When they look at a business sector, there's sort of like, there's that gap. There's that gap in terms of accessibility, in terms of information, in terms of affordability. Those challenges still exist. And then if you don't have a holistic approach to these underlying systemic issues, the problem still exists. So I think it's through multi-stakeholder engagement, that continuous collaborative mechanism that can work for all of us. And that's what we're trying to do, not only as LANET, but as most of the institutions here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bernadette. For Julie, your comment that climate change is sometimes a deresponsibilizing factor, so that in other words, we pack into the definition of climate change too many issues. Colleagues are arguing that if we addressed capacities to answer environmental degradation, water scarcity, pollution, mismanagement in a distinct way, let's say, rather than in a packaged fashion, we would perhaps have much better results and also being able to allocate responsibilities more directly. What would you say about that? Are we correct in packaging a lot of stuff under the heading of climate change, or should we go more in the direction of deconstructing this definition and acting on individual issues?
Thanks for the question, Ilaria. You raised a very good point. Actually, you spoke about deresponsibilization. It's exactly the terms. I mean, if we put a package under which we can have all the issues related to climate change, then we forget to, we underestimate the complexity of the crisis in the Sahel. And we all deresponsibilize ourselves, whatever level we work at, about how we can act on the crisis, how we can solve the crisis. I think the situation is so complex that it calls several solutions that can be put in place in parallel. They can reinforce each other, either at the judicial level or at the political level or at the international community level. So it's really important to have that vision of the crisis that allow us to do distinction and to be able to bring a full set of solutions to a multidimensional and complex crisis. I don't know if I'm clear enough.
Yes, thank you, Julie. And obviously, this is a complex issue, so we would have to discuss it much more in depth to get to a conclusion. There is one more issue that I would like to ask Hindu very, very briefly. Hindu, participants were wondering, and especially Carol Shemeri, how issues arising from gender-related inequalities are addressed at the local level from your community perspective. We know that sometimes there are tensions between traditional customary approaches and women's rights or gender equality. How do you see it from your point of view? If you can reply very briefly in 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. So the gender-related issues, it is very important when we talk about the natural resources and land right and all, because we all know that from the traditional way or religious way, women do not have right to the land in the equal way than men. And however, with the climate change impact, men are used to leave the communities to migrate to the big city or to another places and leave the women behind. and those women do not have the land right to land, and that complicates a bit the way on how they can produce to work, take them children's continuity and life. So for that, I just give you a quick example of one project that I'm working on it. I'm very excited about it. So this project, it is around a national park, and then I organize the women as a group, and then I asked the man to give them the land right in order to produce sustainable agroforestries that can maintain the ecosystem around the national park, and that can help them to the income revenue. So we are in this process when we get all the traditional leaders, traditional communities leaders to sign in the document, the landowner or person to sign in the document, and then to give it to the governors, to the mayors, all of them to sign in order to recognize this land right to the collective women. So this is very important. When you wanted to have a land right for the indigenous communities, ask for the collective land right that can help to give them a better recognition legally than just to leave them in a verbal way. So this project might help them to get the land right and resolve these issues because of the climate change. They are so excluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindu. We have so many questions. We will not have the time to answer through this panel, but I just wanted to highlight a few points from our questions. We have a question from Novita Kumala from Indonesia, stressing the fact that there are tensions between indigenous community and customary law on the one hand, and national or more formal laws on the other hand, and raising the question of land conflict due to the government refusing to acknowledge customary held land. So this is one issue that we haven't really discussed at length, but it has come also through our chat. We also have a question from Henry Adi Topping about internal conflicts and the impact of such conflicts on the efficiency of informal or formal management structure of natural resources. We will not have time to take it, but just signaling that these issues are coming up through our chat. Well, with 2 minutes to go, let me just summarize very briefly, and thanking first of all our speakers and participants for a great discussion, and highlighting the fact that these points, the points that we have discussed today, really illustrate the importance of supporting justice providers in customary, informal, and indigenous systems, not only to reduce conflict over land and natural resources in the context of climate change, but also to be more participatory and embracing different constituencies in their operation. So the point that we should take with us today is really to keep those discussions at the core of climate action conversations, especially if we move, when we move next month to COP26, because if we are committed to leaving no one behind, then we can't do without discussing and engaging with customary and informal justice systems. So with that message, I hope you all enjoyed the conversation today as much as I did. I thank you very, very much for your attention. Thanking also the organizers of the Berlin Climate and Security Conference 2021. Once again, our speakers, Hindu, Bernadette, and Julie. And wishing you all a good continuation of conference, and very best wishes to all. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.